Thank you, Professor Fatul, for the word welcoming speech. Ladies and gentlemen, coming next, we will hear a keynote speech from our honorable speaker, Professor Jasser Auda. Professor Jasser Auda is a scholar of Islam as well as the president of Maqasid Institute Global, and well known for his latest contribution in Islamic scholar is a new Maqasid methodology. And at the end of his keynote speech, we will have a prayer which will be led by Professor Auda. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Auda, and to the professor, the time is yours.
MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala as'adi khalqi wa khatam rusuli Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. رضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين ثم أما بعد. It is always a pleasure to be back in Jogja, albeit today we are in online medium. I would like to thank you for this invitation. I would like to thank Professor Omar Kasuli for the introduction he gave in the name of IIIT. And I would like to thank Prof. Rector for a challenge that he gave and the opening of the question of why we're studying psychology and how to disseminate it. And I think these remarks are very important for the opening of this course. Inshallah, I will be visiting your nice city and the university within 2 weeks from now. So I will be honored to join the course at some point and meet with the students and speak some more. I wanted to share something with you today before, inshallah, I'm able to be there. No, it's not this one. That has to do with methodology. And I think it's very important that we think in terms of how we approach Islamic psychology. I wrote a book recently that is called Re-Envisioning Islamic Scholarship, in which I talked about a proposal to restructure the Islamic scholarship in a way that includes disciplinary studies so that we can restructure disciplines for the sake of Islamic studies. Why do we need to do that? It's because science is not value-free and is not faith-free and is not objective-free. And if we do not restructure science in order for the objectives to be Islamic objectives, we will have non-Islamic objectives that sometimes might contradict with the Islamic objectives. And if we are going to study different aspects of a science with a coming from a particular faith that is not the Islamic faith, we might end up contradicting the Islamic faith. The psychology has to do with the human, and the human in Islam is tied with the faith and tied with the objectives. The ultimate objective is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We divide knowledge in the Maqasid Institute, the work we do, into these 4 areas: usuli studies, disciplinary studies, strategic studies, and phenomena studies. And we're talking here about disciplinary studies, how to restructure psychology in a way that has to do with the reading of the Quran. You heard Professor Omar, when he started to look at the Quran right away. An-nafs and al-jasad, these are Quranic words, because once you get into Islam, you are really talking about the Quran. But the big question would be, like, is this tafsir? The answer is yes and no. The Muslim psychologist will have to do tafsir, but not in the sense of the science of tafsir. The science of tafsir has its schools and its leaders from Al-Tabari to Al-Razi and Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir and so on. And some are Mu'tazili and some are Asha'ira and some are this. And the Fuqaha, some are Ahnaf and some are Shafi'iyah. That is the science of tafsir that takes the Quran from Al-Fatiha all the way to Surah An-Nas in order to read the ayat one by one and explain the ayat. That is the science of tafsir in the tradition. What we need from the Muslim psychologist is a different kind of tafsir. It is still tafsir, but it's an interpretation that depends on the maqasid, and I will explain that, on the objectives of psychology and the objectives of the Quran from the human. And therefore, we are really talking about an ijtihad and a tafsir, but not in the fiqh sense, in the psychology sense. So we are in the business of creating a fiqh for psychology. Fiqhu ilm al-nafs, that really restructures that knowledge away from the theories that could lead our faith and lead our objectives and lead our concepts away from Islam to a theory that is compatible with the Islamic worldview, Tasawwur al-Islami. This tasawwur or worldview or perception or a view, when you view something, how do you define the human? And how do you define health and sickness? And how do you define the ailments that you would like to treat with psychology? And how to define good behavior and bad behavior? The source is the Quran. And the source is not an objective reality like we do in the material sciences, because science in Islam does not depend on objective reality. The Quran is not an objective reality. The Quran cannot be proven in a lab, and we cannot really prove that an angel came to the Prophet ﷺ on this mountain in a material sense. But as believers, we do believe that the angel came to the Prophet ﷺ on this mountain of Hira and gave him that book. And that book is the source of knowledge for humanity, not just for Muslims. And that book has a different, if you wish, epistemological basis for any science, including psychology. Now, to restructure that science, we have to look not just at the fundamental source of knowledge, but at the fundamental logic of dealing with the source. Because as I mentioned so far, people do tafsir by going ayah after ayah in the book of Allah. We want the psychologist or the scholar of psychology to actually integrate, and therefore has a different logic, a logic of connectivity, a logic of integration, systemization, a logic of looking at emerging theories and not particular verses. You can look at particular verses if you're going to develop fiqh in the tashri' sense, jurisprudence, laws. You look at the laws of marriage and divorce and so on. But when you develop a science like psychology, like economics, political science, if you want to talk about Islamic architecture, if you want to talk about Islamic design, that has to come from a logic of integration. It cannot be a logic of fragmentation. We cannot be looking at the Quran in bits and pieces, and we have to integrate. Integrate into what? Into a tasawwur, into a worldview that will generate Nazariyat or theories. We have to come up with theories that come from the Islamic worldview, because the theories that come from non-Islamic worldview, some are acceptable and some are not acceptable. They come from a tasawwur of the world that is not the Quranic tasawwur, is not the Quranic definition of the human, or the Quranic definition of good and evil, or the Quranic definition of morality and immorality, or the Quranic objectives of why we do psychology. Well, psychology is one of the sciences in secular academia, and therefore the why of psychology is economics. why we treat people and why we deal with that science is for the sake of economics. Islam does not have economics as an objective and does not have the political, social or socio-engineering of people as an objective. Yeah, of course, we would like to change society into the better. As Muslims, we want to affect culture, but this is not our ultimate objective. And therefore, the objective of the science comes from a different worldview and therefore will generate different theories. If you look at the theories and the worldviews of psychology, and it's not my area, and therefore I will speak with an accent about psychology, but as a general reader, I wanted to give you some examples about how the worldview affects the theories. If you look at the psychoanalytic theories that come from a Freudian worldview, they are different from the humanistic theories that come from Maslow's worldview, and different from the biological definition of the human that comes from a Darwinian worldview, and is different from the cognitive theories that come from somebody like Piaget worldview. Each of these scientists come from a particular understanding of the universe and of humanity and the definition of the human. Who is the human? And what is good and what is evil for a human? What is bad? What is harmful? And because they come from a different worldview, they have a different theory. If you look at the Freudian Tasawwur that generated the Freudian theories, the unconscious behavior theory, the pleasure principle, how the childhood affects the adulthood, the id, the ego, and the superego. These are theories. These are not nature or facts or any of that. These are just theories proposed by Freud. Some people agree and some people disagree. As Muslims, we have to be able to critique Freud. We cannot come from his perspective as we study Islamic psychology. Otherwise, it is not Islamic psychology. For example, the pleasure principle is not a principle in Islam, in the sense that we do not associate benefit with pleasure. Something could be non-pleasurable, but it is good and moral and beneficial. I fast, and the fasting is hurting me. I am hungry, but I find the pleasure at a higher level, or I define pleasure differently. But because he comes from a particular tasawwur, from a particular world in which the principle is the pleasure, and if it is pleasurable, it is good, they say. Therefore, he imagines the world in a particular way because he views the human components in a particular way and the impact of childhood on adulthood. He makes certain links that are not made in Islam. And if you read the Quran as our source of knowledge, you will see that childhood doesn't define us in that way. He is proposing a theory, and we need to have a counter theory. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, the physiological, the safety, belongings and love, esteem, and then self-actualization. And then towards the end of Maslow's life, by the way, he has a very interesting paper in which he put number 6 there, religious beliefs. So at the end of his life, he included beliefs. Freud was atheist, more or less, but Maslow believed in something. Yet in Islam, we have a different hierarchy of needs. I wrote about this in one of my books in terms of comparing the Maslow's hierarchy of needs with Maqasid Sharia hierarchy of needs, as we have them in the Sharia. And you will see some differences and some agreements. The Islamic psychology cannot even go from the Maqasid Sharia perspective because this is very limited. We have to go back to the Quran, to the original source of Islam. When you look at the Darwinian Tasawwur, Darwin and the philosophy that is associated with Darwin defines the human in a chemical way. Everything is chemistry. The genetics and the blood and the inheritance and the evolution and the nerves and the brain and how it controls the heart and the hormones, and so they define the human as a machine, and they cannot explain something like a dream, for example, from a Darwinian perspective, because the chemical definition of the human doesn't allow that I see something in a dream and then tomorrow I see it in the reality. How do you explain that? My nerves and neural networks and the centers of memory and colors and so forth cannot really do that. And the inheritance cannot explain that. And the genetics cannot explain that. But people coming from a Darwinian perspective, they geneticized the human. They made everything in the human about genetics and about chemistry and about the nerves and so forth. And therefore, we could agree or disagree. The cognitive science, the Piaget Tasawwur, for example, when he said that the cognitive development goes into those 4 stages, and then he explained that. And through that, he is putting a theory for the human. As a Muslim psychologist coming to this course in order to learn about the Islamic psychology, we do not want you to take any of these tasawwurat. You should not adopt any of these theories point blank. There is nothing point blank in Islam. We have to look and critique. How do we critique? And where do we come from? We come from the Quran. We read the Quran and we understand how the tasawwur, or the perception, the definition of the human being, and nafs, and al-ruh, and al-qalb, and al-aql, and these kinds of things, they are very different concepts from the translation in English. We say in English the soul and the spirit and the brain or the mind and the heart. But when we say the heart, we mean the muscle here. We're not talking about al-qalb. Al-qalb in Islam is in the chest. Allah said, وَلَكَنْ تَعْمَ الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. The heart is in the chest, but it's not the muscle. The muscle is a part of the heart. The heart is bigger than the muscle. And the heart, al-qalb, is the place of remembrance and the place of seeing. Allah said, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارُ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. The eyes do not go blind. The hearts go blind. That is a different concept, because in the Darwinian worldview and the other material worldviews, if your eyes go blind, Allah forbid, then you're blind. But in Islam, no, your eyes might go blind, but you are not blind because your heart is not blind. And this is a reality. This is not metaphor and Arabic similes. No, it is a reality. But the reality is defined differently in Islam. And therefore, we proposed in the methodology that we propose in the Maqasid Institute, in order to build on, by the way, the Islamization of Knowledge project. Many of you come from that background, and me too. My ustads were all the Islamization of Knowledge scholars. But we're trying to push the Islamization steps forward. How do you push these steps? By giving the students a method, a progress in steps that they can follow, so that they can generate research. They can generate Nazariyah, or theories. They start with a purpose. And a purpose is not a problem definition. Do not start your research with a problem definition. Why? Because if you don't have a framework, you will misdefine the problem. You will start with the wrong problem. You come from a Freudian world, and therefore your definition of problems is wrong, even before you start. You come from a Darwinian world. Your understanding of the human is not a Quranic understanding, and therefore you cannot start from a wrong problem definition. You have to start from the right problem definition. How do you get the right problem definition? From the framework. And the framework, or if you wish in Arabic, al-itar al-nazari, or al-tasawwur, should come from the Quran. And therefore, step 1 is not problem definition. It's purpose definition. The why that our Prof. Rector talked about. Why are we studying psychology? Or I'm studying this phenomena. I'm studying the phenomena of the relationship between the body and the soul, and how the psychological issues impact the body, or the other way around, a phenomena. Why am I studying that phenomena? And what is the benefit for humanity when I study that phenomena? And therefore, the solutions come after the purpose, because the solutions should not be for the wrong problem. They should be for a purpose. And therefore, from the purpose, you see that there is a problem in the reality or in the description of a phenomena. And therefore, I'm trying to find a solution in order to better the reality, reform the reality. Revelation, or the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is not problem-oriented. Is actually purpose-oriented. Allah in everything subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us what the purpose is, the why, the maqsid. What is the maqsood or the maqsid of the revelation? What is the maqsood of the human? And so forth. The second step after the purpose is what we call cycles of reflection. Each and every student, whether you read in Arabic language, which is a language of Islam, the language of the Quran, or you read a translation, that is also possible. In order to capture the meanings, you have to have cycles of reflection. You have to read the Quran or the translation over and over. And you have to link the Quran with the part of the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that is relevant to your research. Some of the narrations about the Prophet's life sallallahu alaihi wasallam are not relevant to what you're trying to do, and some are. And therefore, read the Quran, link with the Sunnah. This is not a fiqh exercise. We're not going to ask you to give fatwa in the family law, but we will ask you to give fatwa in the psychology law, because yes, psychology has a fiqh and has a law and has a science in Islam. And therefore, we would like to have disciplines here. If you are a lawyer, like myself, I work in the family law issue and the fatwa, and I'm on these fiqh councils, I talk about law, and therefore I cannot really give fatwa about psychology, how to treat a particular ailment, or how to improve the human behavior, or how to reach happiness or sa'ada in Islam. I really cannot, really technically, because I work with law and language and tafsir and hadith and fiqh in the jurisprudence sense. But you, as a student of psychology, we want you to be a mujtahid or a faqih, not in the Shafi'i or the Hanafi sense, but in the psychology sense. Now, this second cycle of reflection is actually urging you to read the Quran. Muslims do not read their own book. And I see Muslims who come and do a PhD with me, and they are not familiar with the Quran. And that is not right. And the Arabic is not the language of Arabs, the language of Islam it is. And if you do not read Arabic, as I mentioned, you can read the translation, but you have to look for the meanings. And you have to look for patterns of connectivity. Everything about the human in the Quran should be connected. Not just the word insan, but insan and bashar and bani Adam and like many words. And not only that, but what is mentioned in the stories and in the examples, and when Allah talks about death and the afterlife and before life, and when Allah talks about the universe and the animals and the plants, connect and try to reach a certain framework. And that framework, it's a long story, but basically I'll give you the titles. We came up with these 7 elements of the framework through which you can define the reality. You can have the tasawwur, or the worldview that you need to have. We're talking about concepts. So what are the concepts? The concept of the human, the good, the evil, the happiness, the sadness. And the sadness in the Quran is not just one. There is al-huzn, wal-ham, wal-hazan, wal-sa'b, wal-bu's, wal-shaqa. And you can count 20 different words. And all of them are actually sadness and negative, but they are different, and they should all be part of a theory of psychology, because Allah is teaching us about us. Objectives, as I mentioned, have to be the objectives of your research, and the objectives from the Quran or the Maqasid. The values or the qiyam, the values of beauty, what is beautiful and what is ugly, has to be defined in the Quran, not defined in the pleasure sense or the material sense. What is moral and what is immoral, the value of morality, The value of harm and benefit has to be defined from the Islamic perspective. And then you're talking about the commands. And as I mentioned, there are commands for the family law and inheritance and wudu and hajj and umrah. It's not your area, but your area are the commands that have to do with the human, with the nafs, with how the qalb or the heart is behaving, what they call in our history fiqh al-qalb. And Prof before me mentioned al-Balkhi, and if you look at al-Juwayni and al-Ghazali and the whole genre of Tasawwur, as he mentioned, you will find many of these commands that have to do with the qalb or the heart. And yes, they are all connected to psychology. When you look at the other elements that we're putting here, the universal laws or as-sunan al-ilahiyya, Allah created meta laws. The Darwinian worldview has meta laws. The linear development of civilization, that's a Darwinian worldview. And the material definition of the human and evolution and the fittest and the strongest, these are meta laws. We need to discover these meta laws or universal laws or sunan ilahiyya in the Quran, because they are going to give us a different perspective on the bigger laws and the bigger functions that Allah created the universe with. The groups are very important as well. The parties. Allah divided people into some people who are sick in their hearts and some people who are healthy in their hearts. There are some people who are reformers and some are mischievers and so forth. And the proofs finally is the logic, is the way we define truth. The ayat of Allah, the ayat are the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do you define truth? And how do you define a fallacy or a non-truth? And then when you build a framework, when you have this from the Quran, you can go to the critical studies. And then you can compare your worldview with other worldview. The Muslim worldview with the Jahili worldview. Some of the non-Muslim views are acceptable. And some of them are Jahiliyyah, are not Islamic. And then when you look at the two frameworks, compare the objectives from the revelation with the objectives from the humans, the concepts, the parties, the commands, the proofs, and then you will start to see the differences in the worldview, and you will start to develop the Islamic psychology as a science. Again, not just for Muslims, but for humanity, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is best for humanity. And then something will emerge. And that emergence is a difficult concept that we might need more time to discuss in some other occasion, which is, now that I have the Quranic worldview, how can I come up with a theory that would require an emergence of the complex theory from the network of the elements of perception? So if you have these elements here, if you look at concepts and objectives and groups and proofs, universal laws, values, you will start to have something that comes to your mind that is not any of these, but you will start to have a theory. And these theories are similar to the theories we talked about. Like if you go back, these theories of, let's say, the pleasure principle, the unconscious behavior, the personality divided into those three, these are theories. They came because of a systematic study of the reality. We as Muslims, we have a systematic study of the Quran, and through that, we could start to have our formative theories and principles. And the integration of the framework will allow us to basically have a better way, an Islamic way of looking at psychology. I just wanted to give an introduction. I can send the book, inshallah, for whoever wants to read it, for the organizers of the conference. And I'm looking forward to visiting your honorable conference and honorable university, and to have a discussion with you as much as you need. Before my flight this evening from Canada time, I wanted to greet you with this word until we meet, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Maqasid for inviting me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Professor Jasser Auda, for the insightful keynote speech. Professor, are you still with us?
Yes,
Yeah,
inshallah.
because at the end, we would like to ask for your help to recite the prayer together to ask for all of mercies and blessings to this event. So it will be an honor for us for you to lead the prayer. Thank you, Professor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أسعد خلقه وخاتم رسله. اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معصيتك، ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك، ومن اليقين ما تهون به علينا مصائب الدنيا. اللهم متعنا بأسماعنا وأبصارنا وقوتنا أبدا ما أبقيتنا، واجعله الوارث منا، واجعل ثأرنا على من ظلمنا، وانصرنا على من عادانا. اللهم لا تجعل مصيبتنا في ديننا، ولا تجعل الدنيا أكبر همنا، ولا مبلغ علمنا، ولا إلى النار مصيرنا. اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك، ونعوذ بعفوك من عقوبتك، ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا، ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا، ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به، واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا، أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر، والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Amin, amin, ya Rabbal Alamin. Thank you so much, Professor.